Hello, everyone. My name is Tyler Moldoff. I am a physical therapist and orthopedic resident at Hospital for Special Surgery. Thank you guys for your patience in dealing with our technical difficulties. Right on target, my presentation is going to be on stress reduction in the runner. I had to do a little of my own stress reduction in preparation of this presentation, but I appreciate you guys' patience. Thank you for joining us, and to those who are listening live, thank you as well for joining us in this discussion. It is an area of interest that I'm quite passionate about, and I hope that it kind of serves you well as you are all runners and are likely looking to optimize your performance, but I feel like this can also help you in other areas as well. Cool. To begin, I have to disclose, I have nothing to disclose. I wish I did, but I don't, and maybe someday I will after this talk. Thank you. Cool. And this is just a quick summary of what we're going to talk about today. You can click again over there. And this is the big pie, 3 pillars of our talk today. It is going to be on breathing, on sleep, and electrolytes. And I'm going to tell you how about those 3 things will be low-hanging fruits, things that you can immediately add into your daily routines, that you don't have to pay $1 million for, you don't have to go travel the world for, and these are things that you can make changes now, immediately. Cool. So to begin, we're going to talk about mindfulness. I think this is an important thing to talk about in 2023. I think by now, it's almost impossible to have not heard this term. You may have heard different ways of explaining its definition, what it means. Everyone kind of has their own renditions, but there actually is truly a definition for mindfulness. So if we click over to the next slide. In essence, it is the ability to pay attention to the present moment, non-judgmentally, unbothered by our thoughts of the future, our thoughts of the past, obligations that are outside of our present moment. For example, we're all here right now. You pay attention to this presentation. I'm delivering this presentation. I'm not thinking about anything else other than this presentation. There's going to be thoughts that try to pop up into my mind to distract me from that, but as I am trying to be mindful right now, I'm going to just filter it out. It's going to happen. It happens to us all. We are human. Good. And I want to talk about mindfulness particularly because there's cool studies coming out recently demonstrating that it can improve our performance, particularly in endurance athletes, as well as some other sports. The first study that I popped the board looked at university athletes. One group practiced mindfulness for 3 weeks, the other group did not. They looked at things like time to exhaustion, accuracy on a cognitive task, and also executive functioning. As you can see by the asterisks labeled above, these are significant changes. And if you're a runner, even the little half a second improvement to your performance makes the difference. First, second place, third place, right? So this was practiced for 3 weeks, and I think the most interesting thing that they looked at in this study was the third piece, executive functioning. They measured something called N2 amplitude. And when I talked about mindfulness earlier, right, the ability to tune out the things that are not relevant to the present moment, that's actually an observable event within the brain, and it's exampled by N2. So they measured that when the 2 groups performed the middle cognitive task. So now if you're performing a task, a challenging one that may give you a little stress in trying to answer quickly, it's going to be helpful to you to be completely plugged in to that task, unbothered by outside things that don't matter. And that was clearly exemplified by that huge difference in that ability to tune out the noise, the things that don't matter. They were able to focus completely on the task. And this one, that was 3 weeks of mindfulness. How about 5 minutes of mindfulness? So this group, they looked at soccer players at halftime. Halftime's a great time to, strategize, to go over what went well, go over a plan for the remainder of the game. So they took half the team, they did that. The other half, they gave them 5 minutes of guided mindfulness intervention. And what they found was the hormone cortisol in their saliva, they measured their salivary cortisol, and they found that the group that performed mindfulness in halftime had decrease in salivary cortisol, the stress hormone. It's a good idea, going into your second half of play, non-stressed, unbothered by the past, and ready to be present and locked into the game or into the race, the second half of the race, wherever you want to apply this to. And also a mental fatigue assessment. So they utilized a validated measure of subjective questioning to evaluate whether or not one half of the group was fatigued mentally. And as you can see, the mindfulness group was actually able to achieve decreased mental fatigue going into that second half, whereas the other group actually had more fatigue. They were their minds were a little jungled, and they were tired from that first half of play. But those who practiced mindfulness were able to actually get back into a present state of mind. Good. And I am a physical therapist by trade. So this article over here is really, it rings bells for me because pain tolerance is a big aspect of physical therapy, recovering from injury, particularly in runners who unfortunately experience a good amount of injuries. So essentially, they looked at a few things. I think the thing that really popped out to me was pain perception. When patients practice mindfulness simultaneously with their plan of care for physical therapy, they actually perceive pain less intensely than those who do not practice mindfulness, at least in this study here. Now, you may be wondering, how did they assess tolerance to pain? Nothing crazy. They had them stick their hand in an ice-cold tub and assess how long they can keep their hand in. They didn't do anything violent to these participants, promise. But just another interesting fact of mindfulness. Cool. So we talked a lot about mindfulness, but I really wanted to get to breathing. Breathing is typically step one to mindfulness. You download these apps, you look at a YouTube video, they're going to say, step one, mindfulness, okay, we're going to focus on our breath. You're going to count your in, you're going to count your out. Be present of your breath, the inflow, the outflow. You may have heard of that in a yoga class or just a guided mindful intervention. So why breathing? Why is it so important? Well, I'm going to dive into a little bit of the anatomy, physiology, just so you understand breathing on a slightly deeper level than the average person. So if you go back real quick, the left arrow twice, there we go. These are some of the primary muscles of breathing. The big all-star of the show is the one above, the diaphragm muscle, which is attached to the base of the lungs. And we'll talk about how that functions. And then there's also the transverse abdominis. It is the deepest layer of our core musculature. You may be familiar with rectus abdominis, our six packs, the obliques, the other diagonal muscles, but this lies deep below, and it is involved in core endurance, but also breathing. And if you go to the next slide. So when that diaphragm muscle, dome-shaped muscle that was at the top of the figure previously, attached to the base of the lungs, when you inhale, that dome will flatten, and it'll pull the lungs down and expand the lungs for you. Now, when you expand the lungs, you are increasing the volume within the lungs. If you studied elementary science, you may or may not have learned that pressure and volume have this inverse relationship. So when volume increases, the pressure within the lungs goes down a little bit relative to the air that we are breathing. So when you increase the volume, the pressure, oxygen in the atmosphere will naturally just flow into our bodies. And then when you let that diaphragm go, it'll eccentrically return back to that dome shape, increasing the pressure in the lungs, forcing the air out into the atmosphere. Our body is always seeking equilibrium, right? Especially with pressure and some other aspects of science as well. And then ultimately, this is all filtering into a process of taking in oxygen, giving our cells and our muscles oxygen to perform and do its duties within the body. And then ultimately, when that red blood cell makes its way back into the lungs, it's carrying CO2 with it. We don't like CO2, we get it out of our bodies. And that will actually be an important concept that we'll address a little later in the presentation. But that's breathing 101. Cool. And next, breath work, right? So we know about mindfulness, we know about breathing, and it's basics. But when you actually pay attention to your breath and you actually make it into an exercise, it's called breath work. And a recent study looked at breath work and stress reduction. They actually compared a couple different breath work techniques to mindfulness. And they found that spending 5 minutes a day for 3 weeks practicing breath work is more effective, at least in this study, than mindfulness in acutely improving your optimism, reducing your stress and anxiety. So I take it with a grain of salt because I argue that focusing on your breath and breathing is a mindful practice. But in this case, in this study, mindfulness was defined as just being present, just hanging out, eyes closed, anything that comes to mind, you address it, you welcome it, you say, hey, I'm thinking, that's a negative thought, but I'll think about it later. That form of mindfulness. And if you click again, they also compared the 3 different forms of breath work, which was box breathing, cyclic sighing, and hyperventilation with a hold. So I'm going to just cover 2 that I feel are a little bit more digestible, more easily implemented into one's daily activity. 5 minutes of what's called box breathing entails breathing in, holding, breathing out, holding, and repeat. It's kind of like a box. You inhale for about 4 seconds, you hold that breath for 4 seconds, exhale for 4 seconds, hold, and then repeat. Box breathing. Makes sense. And then the other, cyclic sighing, which was actually shown to be the most effective breath technique that they studied in this article. Cyclic sighing, otherwise known as the physiological sigh. It's not the easiest headline activity, but what that is a deep inhale either through the nose or through the mouth. Once you feel you're all filled up, you take a quick little additional inhale, a double inhale, followed by a letting it all out. So essentially, the participants did that for 5 minutes straight. 2 long inhales, a long exhale out. That was the most effective breath work technique in immediately improving your mood, mental focus, and reducing anxiety. Cool. And breath work and sleep. That's all you guys right there, having a good night of sleep. There was a cool study that I found, and it was looking at nurses who were working during the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously a very stressful time, and they were approached by a research group that wanted to look at diaphragmatic breathing, which is another form of breathing. I mentioned the muscle, the diaphragm. You may have heard of belly breathing. Instead of breathing through your chest and your shoulders, allowing your belly and your ribs to expand and come back in. And they found that, hey, when they performed that for 10 minutes a day for approximately 3 weeks, they found that their sleep quality improved, reported by the nurses. Their duration of sleep improved. They had better sleep efficiency. They woke up less during the night. And also during the day, they had better functioning, less dysfunction during the day as a result of their improved sleep, which came about through their breathwork techniques. Cool. And just another benefit of breathing. This is a new study that recently came about, and it talks about something called heart rate variability. Okay, so try to follow me on this one. So our breath and our heart rate are very closely, intimately related to one another. If you look at the graphic on the left side of the screen, you'll see that those waves go up and down. The black straight line, the black solid line, is your inspiration, breathing in. When you breathe in that moment, your heart actually beats just a little bit faster. And then when you exhale, you expire air, you blow out the CO2, your heart rate beats just a little slower. And this actually has to do with an interesting pressure-volume relationship between the heart and the lungs. When you breathe in, the diaphragm pulls the lungs down, the lungs get drawn down. It creates more space for the heart to sit in. Thus, the heart is actually relatively bigger in that moment, making it have to pump more vigorously to supply itself. Your heart itself needs its own blood supply. It has to pump faster because it's bigger. When you exhale, the diaphragm returns, the lungs go back up, the heart now occupies a smaller space. In that moment, the heart is smaller. It doesn't have to pump as rapidly to supply itself with blood, which is why that relationship is so very cool and kind of new in the literature, which is really exciting. And another important aspect of why heart rate variability is important to the runner or any athlete is that it also, you can measure it to see how quickly you can go from an extremely high heart rate when you're running a marathon, how quickly can you get back to a resting heart rate? Nice, calm, cool, collected breathing. That is reflected by your heart rate variability, which is why it's so important. Cool. So a little bit more about heart rate variability. As I mentioned, it improves things like aerobic capacity, endurance, but more importantly, it's also been shown to be related to stress reduction, improved mood, decreased anxiety, mindfulness. All of those things are correlated with increasing heart rate variability. And like I mentioned, if you have a higher heart rate variability, you're better able to calm your heart rate down from an elevated state. So high heart rate variability is a good thing. Low heart rate variability, more consistency, like a metronome, like boom, 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 is actually less ideal. You want it to be a little bit more variable between our breathing. So just tapping into that really cool aspect of our physiology is something that you can implement tonight if you wanted to. Cool. This is a bit advanced and honestly a little bit out of my realm, but I would say, but this cool article showed that when runners are guided by their heart rate variability, there are apps that can do this. There are coaches who are specialists in this. Exercise physiologists, I know very much about this process. But essentially, if you undergo what's called polarized training, you're better able to harness this power of heart rate variability. And essentially what it includes is very high intensity a few days, and then lesser intensity for the other days. So you get that really big, rapid rate in heart rate, in breathing rate, and then essentially for the other part of the week, you let yourself do nice, calm, cool jogs. This is interesting, something that I want to do a little more research on, but I would definitely, if you were interested in guiding your running capacity by heart rate variability, you would use an app, you would address an expert, most likely a physiologist. Cool. Okay, and now this is almost done with breathing, I promise. This one's exciting for me. Like I mentioned, your breath muscles are actually also kind of your core muscles, right? Like I mentioned, that transverse abdominis muscle, it kind of looks like a corset. It's right over here somewhere. And then like I mentioned, there's rib muscles, there's neck muscles that also help out with breathing, but they're not quite as effective as the diaphragm. Long story short is they found that one of the key indicators of fatigue during a run, a high-intensity run in high-intensity professional runners, is core muscle fatigue correlating to respiratory fatigue. So as you run a really long time, your core muscles are going to get tired from all that breathing you're doing, and then guess what? It's going to be harder to deliver that oxygen to the muscles that need it, in your legs, in your feet, in your bones, and it's going to be harder to blow out the CO2 that is so harmful to us. Our muscles don't like CO2. We like it out. We want to get it out. So just very interesting that they found that core muscle fatigue and respiratory fatigue influences your performance as a runner. Good. And to add to that, you might think, well, if our core muscles are technically breathing muscles, wouldn't it make sense to work on your core muscles? And this study looked at that, and they said, yeah, there's a benefit to training the core in endurance athletes. This was looking at an 8-week study. They took one group of runners, they had them do core stuff. The other group, they did their thing. They ran and did what they usually do. And they found improvements in these two tests are in respect to balance and overall body awareness, but they also did find improvements in time to exhaustion and other metrics that are important for runners and endurance-based findings. But as you can see, big difference. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So thus far, we covered mindfulness, and then we said step one of mindfulness is breathing. Why breathing? We talked about it. Stress reduction, heart rate variability, core muscles, all that good stuff. Breathing is good, mindfulness is good. And now we got electrolytes. What are electrolytes? Electrolytes, you may have heard of calcium, sodium, chloride, magnesium, all really important things. Essentially, what they do, they monitor our electrical balance, not only in our blood, but in our brain and in our muscles and in our nerves. Everywhere there's fluid in our body, which is seemingly everywhere, electrolytes are present. And you may have heard of brands like Gatorade saying, hey, supplement with electrolytes and perform at your best self and things like that. But in essence, it's important for all the functions of the body and the cells. So, cool study I found, fairly recent, looked at the concentration of certain electrolytes and our mental health. This one, particular, was looking at sodium. Sodium, I don't know, it's got an interesting rap, sodium. Some people say it's good, some people say it's bad, but in the literature, in healthy adults, not taking medication and not chronic health issues, sodium is actually very protective of our body. It's actually super important, and as you can see, they looked at 24-hour supply of sodium in the body. They measured this by measuring it in the urine of the participants of the study, and then they had them fill out surveys about how they're feeling, day-to-day, stress, things like that. And they found that when they had more sodium in their system, they were less likely to have depression. They were less likely to also have anxiety and stress. As you can see in the bottom one, they also include potassium into that ratio. So potassium is also another electrolyte that you want to kind of have increased along with sodium to improve and really harness those mental capacity improvements. Good. And now electrolytes and heart health. Like I mentioned, electrolytes are present in all fluid areas of the body. Every cell has electrolytes. Super, super important for that whole process I was talking about with lung expansion and heart rate. It requires a steady concentration of particular electrolytes. And when they're out of balance, things aren't working and functioning so properly. So this study, you may or may not have heard of ideal ranges of what is healthy for sodium. Recent studies are actually showing that the common understanding, if you're familiar or not unfamiliar, they seemingly seem to promote 2 grams a day is like kind of what you should be getting. But then if you dig deeper into the research, it actually shows that the ranges that the average American is getting through their diet, through their fluids, whatever, is actually not enough. And if you look at this weird-looking chart over here, essentially you just need to get 2 numbers from there, 4 to 6. They found that 4 to 6 grams a day of sodium, 4,000 to 6,000 milligrams, if you want to convert, is actually associated with decreased heart events, decreased cardiovascular events, decreased stroke, decreased heart attack. And then they found that less than 3 grams, which is typically what's promoted, is associated with more hospital visits, more cardiovascular events. And I definitely implore anyone listening to this to check out the new literature. I'd be happy to discuss it and learn more from anyone who has more to say on this topic. But it certainly is interesting that new literature is pointing to the direction that, hey, most of us aren't getting enough salt, especially in the summertime when we're sweating and we're losing electrolytes every second. Every word I speak, I'm spitting out electrolytes into the air. So 4 to 6. Cool. Interesting. Not only the heart suffers from electrolyte imbalance, but our bones as well. Now, bone injuries, stress fractures is a super, super common issue in runners, but also just in all humans as we begin to age. So a really revelatory finding that this study found was that there's actually an association between sodium intake and your bone health. And they found that those who consume less sodium and produce less sodium in their urine actually have increased markers that are suggestive of being on the path or already in osteoporosis, weakening of bones. If you heard of bones being a bank for calcium, that's typically what we hear on commercials and in school and whatnot. It's also a bank for sodium. So if we don't have enough circulating sodium or calcium in our blood, it's got to get it from somewhere. And unfortunately, our bones take the brunt of that force. Sodium will then leave the bone to supply our muscles and everything else, our brains, with sodium, while our poor bones suffer from this process. And of course, talking to runners, that's really who I'm gearing this presentation towards. Sodium not only sodium, but the other electrolytes are super important for our performance. And if you dig into the research and the literature, it's actually supported that for every hour of intense activity, endurance activity, running a marathon takes usually a couple hours to perform, that you want to consume 300 to 600 additional milligrams of sodium per hour of activity. And that's because when you are physically active, especially in something super draining like a marathon, your electrolytes will immediately plummet and it will need refueling. So they say for every hour, that's the recommended amount. And this was a systemic review that looked at a bunch of different studies and really found the highest quality evidence. And they also talked about how having water after or during is likely insufficient in regaining these electrolyte balances. Because water, unless it's enhanced or from a mountain stream, it's not really going to have many electrolytes within it. So, in fact, by trying to drink a gallon of water after a super intense endurance run, you're actually going to do yourself likely more harm than good because you will have more water in the system, even less electrolytes. So, they definitely promote that you want to kind of have that alignment, that sodium intake alignment, because you're going to lose so much of it in an endurance feat. You got to replace it. Every hour of activity, continuous, you want to have 300 to 600 milligrams. Cool. So thus far, we talked about mindfulness. We talked about breathing. We talked about electrolytes. If you're able to tell by now, there seemingly is like a nice correlation between these, at least the two things we discussed so far, that electrolytes affects our performance, our breath affects our sleep. They all kind of correlate together. So that kind of led me now to talking about sleep. So if you take a look, it's a no-brainer in my opinion, but recent studies found that poor sleep results in poor function. Less able to perform high-level cognitive functioning, not only high-level cognitive functioning, but physical functioning as well, performance, athletic endeavors, even just being present and having the fuel and the capacity to go on through your day. If you have poor sleep habits, it's likely going to do you harm. Some people are the opposite, but I would say those are the outliers. Some people can somehow get by without sleep, but the average person needs their sleep. And there's different reasons why people have troubles with their sleep. They might have weird schedules, whatever the case may be. And as that chart demonstrates, far and few between detriments of poor sleep. But the good news is there's studies to show that focusing on sleep, really trying to make an effort to improve your sleep through different methods, can kind of reverse that change and improve your performance cognitively, physically, emotionally, all aspects. Cool. And we can bring up those slides. And so not only does sleep improve our cognitive and our physical performance, it also does that in a way that's not so obvious. So when we lack sleep, there's actually a correlation between increased snacking, increased late night snacks, higher energy intake. For whatever reason, the article did not conclude why this happens, but there is a relationship. If you have less sleep, you tend to eat more calories for whatever reason. I don't know. And not only is that the case, but this weird looking diagram here, it's a little confusing, but it goes into the nitty gritty. But all you got to pay attention to is the highlighted sections. Short sleep duration is associated with a dysfunction in the release of insulin, which is super important to bringing energy from our food to our muscle cells and all the other cells in our body. But glucose intolerance, and that's really important. So when you lack sleep, you are less able to extract energy from your food. Let me repeat that again. So when you lack sleep, you are less able to get energy from your food the next day. That is so incredibly important because if you're lacking sleep, you're not adequately using your energy sources. Runners tend to load up on carbohydrates or whatever diet that they are undergoing. That's seemingly the most common. Although you're eating the right things, if you're not sleeping, you're not going to make use of those energy-dense calories. Instead, it's going to be used to waste. It's going to store as fat in places you don't want it to, and you're not going to be as efficient at utilizing energy, plain and simple. Cool. And interestingly enough, there is a crossover. We were talking about electrolytes and hydration. This study showed that a decreased sleep duration, 6 hours or less, is linked to more concentrated urine. Thus, they find that there's a higher chance that someone who is not sleeping over 6 hours is likely dehydrated in some way, shape, or form. And chicken or the egg, what comes first? Is it because you're not hydrated well, that you're not sleeping well, or you're not sleeping well, so you're less able to process your electrolytes? That's unknown, but it is shown that hydration is linked to sleep quality and duration. Just an important thing to consider. Nice. And now I talked about all these things, right, about sleep, but I gave you methods of improving your breath and improving stress, right? But how about improving sleep? So I don't want to give you a billion different methods, but one of the cooler, in my opinion, research that's coming out about improving your sleep is that morning sunlight, upon waking up, within that first hour or two of waking up, you are actually encouraged to go outside, get sunlight. Don't look directly in the sun, please. Don't say that I told you to do that. But being outside, sunlight coming in, moving, really sparks what's called the circadian rhythm. You may or may not be familiar with this, but essentially it's our own internal clock that governs all of our cells, all of our functioning. So essentially when you get that morning sunlight, the clock starts and all the cells in your body are like, all right, we got 12 hours of this day, and then we're going to start tuning things down. So getting that morning sunlight is associated with improvements in mental health, improvements in cognitive functioning, physical performance, but sleep. Morning sunlight helps you fall asleep at night. It's so cool. And so I would recommend to those listening online and here, as hard as it is to roll out of bed, try your best to roll out of bed and go for a little walk, or maybe open a window. It's shown that the sunlight coming through the window actually doesn't quite do it. You actually need to be exposed to the sunlight to actually reap this benefit of improvements in sleep. I didn't make it up. And next, of course, I am a practicing physical therapist. I am not an MD, so I'm not telling you what to take supplementally, but it is important to know that the combination of an electrolyte that we were once talking about, magnesium, combined with an amino acid called L-theanine. It's actually a naturally occurring substance. You can find it in chamomile tea. So if you don't want to go and buy something that looks like that up there, you can have a cup of chamomile tea, and you can have a multivitamin with magnesium in it if you don't want to buy something that has them combined. But this cool study recently came out, and it showed that compared to the classic sleep medication, melatonin is involved in that circadian rhythm, that clock that kickstarts in the morning when our sunlight enters our eyes. But for whatever reason, a common finding with melatonin is that it helps people fall asleep, but it doesn't help people stay asleep. And what's the use in that? We want to stay asleep. So this combination between magnesium and L-theanine does really cool things. It happens to reverse the effects of caffeine on our sleep. We all drink coffee, tea, something containing caffeine, we drink it. We're humans, that's what we do. And it actually, I don't want to get too deep into it, but it impacts our sleep and the ability to recover and do all the important things that happen while we do sleep. So it is cool to show that this little compound here, L-theanine, an amino acid that we pretty much need, and it's probably in a lot of our protein-rich foods, and magnesium, just a normal occurring electrolyte that we need. You supplement with those two, it helps with your sleeping, helps with your brain recovery and your cognitive functioning while you sleep. All right, wow. We're finally here at the concluding thoughts. So I wanted to kind of just really emphasize 3 low-hanging fruits, in my opinion, that can be almost immediately employed, even after this talk today, to immediately improve not only your performance, your recovery, but more importantly, your mental and cognitive health, your ability to be emotionally available to the ones you love, to be focused at your job, forget performance and whatnot. You want to be a functioning human being that is at your best self. You want to feel your best self. So immediately, you can make improvements to your sleep if you work on it. You can make improvements to your electrolyte balance if you are consuming the right things. And you can improve your breathing. Yes, you can improve your breathing through deliberate, focused practice. Just like anything else, practice makes perfect/permanent whatever you practice. If you're practicing good habits, you will get better at it. And it'll become less arduous, less taxing. You won't have to think about it as hard. It'll just kind of become part of your natural your living day to day. And so that's what I have to say today about these 3 super important aspects of our health. I hope that it can help anyone here in the audience, those listening online, and I'd be happy to take any questions, feedback from the audience, but I think we might be checking out and seeing if there's any questions online first. So just hang tight.
Does anybody in the audience have any questions? We can do a little pass around the mic and no pressure.
No pressure at all.
Maybe we could do one online? No questions online.
All right. I guess everyone got the message. Yes. We got one in the audience.
It's maybe a simple question, but people are always saying when you take like Gatorade or something, like you've got to watch the sugar. Is there a problem with that? Because I feel like the Gatorade does really help me after a long run or during the long runs, and I am worried about sugar intake. Is there any problem with it?
That's a great question. Because, Gatorade is a commonly promoted in-your-face item with running. It has electrolytes, but it has sugar. It has like about 30-something grams of sugar per serving. So interestingly enough, and we can dive into a whole bunch of research on that, but sugar seems to be, you want to supplement with electrolytes minus the sugar, in short. The sugar is not a beneficial aspect of the electrolyte mix, and any supplemented drinks with electrolytes in it, you want to make sure there's no sugar in there or artificial sweeteners. Really just go straight for the electrolyte-infused drinks and be on the lookout for any added sugars. But yeah, excellent question.
Hi. Excuse me. Just to piggyback on what she said. So what about the Pedialytes? Does that have too much sugar? Or?
I have not looked at the nutrition facts of Pedialyte recently. To my understanding, it is a commonly promoted item as well. If I had to bet, I would say it has far less sugar, I may be wrong, than Gatorade, and I would say Pedialyte is a great option for electrolyte supplementation. Yep. As long as it's not loaded up with sugar or artificial sweeteners. Nice. Good questions.
Any other questions in the audience? Anything online? Good.
Okay, cool. Thank you guys for coming and staying and listening and asking really good questions. And thank you to those online who are listening now or may listen in the future. And thank you for having me. And I would love to do more of these. This is a lot of fun. Thank you.